All right, Dr.
Very
Menegon.
good.
You.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. I'm Eugenio Menegon from Boston University History Department and also affiliated with the Center for Global Christianity and Mission, that is the main sponsor of the China Historical Christian Database. And today we are meeting for our second day for session 4 on networks. In particular, our session is entitled What Scholars Imagine and What Digital Humanities Could Deliver. So there is a little bit of experience here, but also a lot of dreaming of what we could be doing in the future. And our 4 presenters today will talk about different experiences and different ways that we can see how to use, to leverage digital scholarship in order to learn more about the exchange of knowledge between China and the West through missionaries, but also in many other ways. And here we have an historian of science, we have some historians of Christianity in China, we have some historians of late imperial China. I will be the first presenter, and so I will not say very much about myself, except that I teach in the Department of History at Boston University, and maybe later I will send you a little link with some more information about myself. So here it is, and that's what I will be doing. I will be introducing our speakers very quickly. You have some information actually on the materials of that you have received, and I will also send a link to panelists and attendees where you can learn more about their work. So I will now share my screen, and I will start my own PowerPoint. Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yeah,
Alison, we are set?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have 15 minutes, so I'm going to start my stopwatch right now. The title of my presentation today is The Global Connections of Catholic Missionaries Before 1800. And I'm really interested, as I mentioned in the abstract, in how our database, the China Historical Christian Database, can actually capture the global dimension of the presence of actors in China who at the same time, be they Westerners or Chinese, really connected with global networks. Right now, the database actually is focusing, for reasons of really practicality, on China itself. It is already an enormous enterprise. But obviously, we are all aware that these actors moved frequently from one place to another. They came from Europe, sometimes they went through the Americas, they circumnavigated Africa, they were in India first, sometimes from China they moved on to Korea, to Vietnam, to Japan, to the Philippines. So really there's a lot of mobility here. And how do we capture that dimension? So that's my dream, the dream of what a scholar can imagine could be done. We have been doing this, of course, global history has been doing this for a long time in analog forms. And now with the digital revolution, we're starting to see opportunities to do this on a larger scale. Yesterday, in panel 1 in particular, Ruth Mostern spoke about this new way of looking at the infrastructure of digital scholarship as a way to connect different sets of data. And therefore, it is imaginable that in the future, we will be able to connect our China data with the data about the Philippines, Japan, Europe, and so on, and see really these networks in their globality. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about the ingredients of our database, but also of any research that is based on an understanding of networks. First, the who. Who are we talking about when we look at Christianity in China and its global connections? We are talking obviously of the missionaries. Here I have some images between the Ming and the Qing dynasty, the usual suspects from Matteo Ricci to Adam Schall to Ferdinand Ferbist. This is the old China mission before 1800. But of course, we also talk about Chinese actors. Here we have a picture of Xu Guangqi and his grandniece, Candida Xu. So men and women in China. In this case, they are members of the elite during the late Ming and the early Qing period. We have emperors like the Kangxi emperor that was a patron of the missionaries during the 17th and early 18th century. And so big characters in history, like the popes. Clement XI, for example, who was the pope that sent 2 legations or embassies to the Kangxi emperor to discuss the issue of the Chinese rights, is another of these important world figures at the time. We have also intermediaries like Carlo Tommaso Maillard de Tournon, who was sent as ambassador of the Pope to the Kangxi Emperor, and who brought with him to China a group of secretaries and priests, traveled across different parts of the world, and studying, for example, just the legation of Tournon would be a big exercise in mapping networks. We then have regular common Christians. Here we see a famous painting of the Beihang, the northern church in Beijing, which was the church of the French Jesuits near the Imperial Palace, with a representation of the liturgical celebration of the Blessed Sacrament. And there is an image where I zoomed in, and you can see a priest with the sacrament, with acolytes, and then all these small figures. These are all men, some are children, who are participating in this special feast within the enclosure of the church. These are people from Beijing, men from the Christian community of Beijing, maybe even surrounding. Some might be members of the elites, but others might be just commoners who have traveled from different parts of the city or from the villages of the hinterland to participate in this ceremony. So the who is really also quite varied. You can have different kinds of social classes within China, but once you start also moving outside of China, then you start seeing that this differentiation gets even more complicated, bringing in the social structure of other countries. The other question that we ask, of course, is where things are happening, and the database is really about locating people in places and in institutions, structures. Here we see an early way of capturing that, a map that was produced in 1687 by Philippe Couplet and others, entitled Map of the 15 Provinces and 155 Capital Cities of the Chinese Empire with the churches and residences of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. So this is in a way a predecessor, an ancestor of what we want to do. And it transfers on paper, on a map, both churches as well as the towns where this Christian enterprise was developed in the early period. We also have to keep in mind that there is mobility and travel all the time, that these are not just fixed places on a map. Here, for example, I just give you the example of the return travel of the ambassador of the Pope in 1706 or 7 towards the south, and the places that he went through. And that is possible, of course, for each individual, both Chinese and Western. If we have enough documentation, if we have enough letters, we can really follow their travel, both the travel globally from the West to China, from China to the West. There were procurators going back, but there were also Chinese going back to Europe, to Europe to be trained, for example, as priests, or to accompany some of the Westerners, and then they would also come back. There was a college in Naples, the College of the Chinese college that trained Chinese priests between the 18th and the 19th century, and there were similar other institutions. So there's a lot of mobility as well. And then we have to consider that besides this global or national level picture, we also have the local picture. Here we see again the Peitang. We see where it is located within the city of Beijing. And so we're going down to the level of a city, albeit an important one. We see ancient maps like this one produced by the missionaries that actually abstract the Christian presence for the reader out, I would say, of the picture of the real city of Beijing. Here, all you see is an outline of the imperial palace, the city walls, and then the churches. So it is the invisible Christian city, invisible because it was to an extent closed behind walls, and especially after 1724, when Christianity was forbidden, it was necessary to keep the activities within the walls. Within another invisible city, because the Westerners here are only seeing the churches. They are not really seeing very much of the urban fabric and the vibrancy of the city of Beijing. But then we can also start understanding the local in context. Here, for example, there is a map from the book by Susan McCann on Peking temples that starts giving some more context, religious context in this case. We see the churches of the Christians in the Neichang, the inner city of Tartar city, but we also see other institutions, the Russian chapel, mosques, Buddhist temples, and of course we could multiply this many, many more times as Nakeng has done in her book and others have done by looking at the hundreds and hundreds of temples that dotted the city. And so we start putting together actually Christian presence with the presence of other religions, other social institutions. Yesterday there was a question about that by Elena Valussi about bringing together, for example, Buddhism, Taoism, other religions, and Christianity. And there are ways to get to this that are also very much based in visual images. We can have a sense of place also by looking at old pictures. Some of them, rarely for the period I'm studying, are photographs. Most of the times they are drawings. They give sometimes a sense of the buildings themselves, but other times we can even get a sense of what is around them. And there is some great scholarship that has been produced recently on this. Wan Lianming, for example, at Heidelberg has been doing this. Here we see a church that was rebuilt after the Boxer uprising. So on the site of an older church, the Eastern Church that existed since the 17th century. And here you see it in the new urban fabric of Beijing today. It has become the only ancient monument, ancient quote unquote, along Wangfujing, the main commercial avenue of Beijing. And it's a place where you go to take pictures. Many people, also non-Christian, who get married want to take nice wedding pictures in front, all dressed, you know, the bride all dressed up in white. And of course, this is a very different view that you would have had in the past. When I went in the 80s to Beijing, for example, the city, this place was completely walled off. You couldn't really get close. Now it has become a public square. There are places like the observatory in Beijing. Those of you who have visited it today understand how different it is. It is actually this sort of orphan structure in the middle of highways near one of the major financial centers of Beijing. The other thing is, how do we go about understanding the who and the where? And here we can use already existing admirable scholarship that has been produced in the last century. Here I give some example, the Répertoire des Jésuites, for example, by De Hergne, but there are also online resources. For example, the Mission Étrangère de Paris in Paris has a new institute, Institute of Research France Asia, and they have a database that is based on scholarship from the 1920s and 30s by the archivist of MAP, Launay, with a lot of French material, biographies, for example, of China missionaries and missionaries across Asia, also beyond China. The old structure of the Ricci Roundtable was doing that, and now we are trying to actually recover that data and include it in our database. Of course, we have manuscript sources in Western languages. Some of them are being printed. And so here I give you the example of the Acta Pekinensis. So this is the how we get to the data. We have obviously all kinds of other materials in Chinese and in other languages like Manchu, the example of the Red Manifesto here from 1716. We have visual and material things here. For example, we have the astronomical instruments cast by Furbist in Beijing, but they also take other shapes. They become prints, and then later on they travel in other places, as they did here in Japan, and they become a prop within a very famous print by Utagawa Kuniyoshi of one of the characters in the Shui Hu Zhuan. But some people have interpreted this. Maybe this is a sort of hidden representation of Ferdinand Furbist in Chinese/Japanese garb. So the who, the where, the how, and of course, as historians, we need to pay attention to the when. And I would say that, and this is the point of what I'm saying today, how do we capture that the global dimension in our database and in future federations of databases? This was a really global enterprise. Here we see the routes of travel for the early generation of Jesuits from Portugal all the way to East Asia. Here we see the global networks of the East India companies during the 18th century that were used also by missionaries to go to China, by Chinese to go to Europe. And these are really the global networks, the mobility global networks that connected all of this at the time. I have to stop here because my time is up. I actually have done some work in particular on two individuals, Giuseppe Provana and Luigi Fanshouyi. They were actually sent as ambassadors by the Kangxi Emperor to Rome in order to discuss the after effects of the embassy of Cardinal Maillard de Tournon and try to patch up things between the Holy See and Kangxi. And I only want to show you very quickly, because my time is up, one thing that I did. I wrote a biography of one of them, in particular, Provana. And even if there had been biographical work before, I discovered through my own work that actually he was member of an important noble family from the kingdom of today's Piedmont, of Savoy. And I figured out that he was chosen as ambassador because he came from a family of ambassadors. But this was not even known to missionary historians. So all of a sudden, we can, by doing research in the aristocracy of the Kingdom of Savoy, discover a whole new level of connections, of networks that are happening in Europe. The father was an ambassador to the King of France and to the Pope, as was his brother. And so it's just fitting that he himself was chosen as ambassador of the Chinese emperor to the Pope. And he has a Chinese companion, so there are also Chinese traveling to Rome. Fan Shouyi actually, when he returns to China, has an interview with the Kangxi emperor. So that's very important. We see the importance of this global extension. So I'll stop here. I'm a little bit late, and I will actually now stop sharing and open the Q&A. So you can type questions on the Q&A, and I will be able to see them. So there is a first question by Professor Xiaoqing He, who was one of the speakers yesterday. Some names of places and people are very difficult to identify in the missionaries' literature in foreign languages, such as Shilou in the Fonti Ricciane, which has been discussed by different scholars. How do you deal with this problem? Well, certainly this is one of the issues that we have to deal with a database like ours. Sometimes scholars have already done a lot of work before us. I showed, for example, the repertoire by the Herne. That's a low-hanging fruit. He was the archivist of the Jesuits in France, and he spends all his life studying the geography of the Catholic mission and the prosopography of the Catholic mission, especially of the Jesuits in China. So he has already done a lot of work. But there are cases, especially with Chinese individuals, where data still needs research. And this is what a database like ours has to do, has to keep abreast of the latest research and try to get scholars who are experts in one particular topic to get involved. So we really welcome, in fact, young students who are writing their master thesis or their PhD thesis, or professors who are doing research on particular individuals to collaborate with us, to make us aware of their research, and maybe to input their data so that we can go into finer detail and learn more and more about finer and finer local kind of networks. A second question from Eastern Law. Are you familiar with Jose Casanova's overarching thesis on Jesuits as the first wave of globalization? Connecting the global dots across the world vis-a-vis trade routes as well would be really interesting. I am aware, and I really think that this is the way to go, but for practical reasons, we are starting somewhere. China is already big enough, but we are totally aware that we need to move in that direction. There are institutions that are trying to do that. I'm also associated with the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies at Boston College in Boston. And there, for example, are one of the globalists who are trying to do this. And there are people around the world who study the Jesuits, which can be said to be one of the earliest global corporations, as being really a global enterprise. We hope that federations in the future will be available to really do this kind of work. Ruth Mostern is asking, I'm thinking about the exciting vision of capturing the global mobility of Catholic missionaries whose life included China, but who also traveled widely. Have you thought about mapping their life paths through time and space to focus on the temporal and spatial modeling of individual lives? One first step, this is the response, is that we are tracking the ships. And so we are seeing when they left, which ship they used, when they arrived, and things like that. For now, since we are not covering the oceans, we'll not be doing that, but I've written an article, for example, on the travel of two missionaries in 1732 from Rome to Beijing, how long it took. I was lucky to find all the letters. So it is possible to do that. And Frederick Fermonte mentions that there are interactive maps out there, and there is a software that we could be using. And certainly going forward, that would be wonderful, maybe as an offshoot of the database. There are many questions now, but we are up for time. So we are saving these questions, and I will be happy to follow up personally with the people who have written. And also, please do come tomorrow at our final roundtable, where you will have a chance to talk about these issues again, ask your questions, too many questions right now. So let's move on to our next presenter, Professor Catherine Jamy. She is Director of Research in the CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. And I will be putting her link on the chat so you can learn about her more. But without further ado, she's going to talk about mapping knowledge circulation in and beyond Qing China.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am at the moment trying to share my screen. Yes. I hope you can now see what, no, you can now see my screen. I'll just need a second to, yes, that's right. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the workshop, and in particular, Eugenio Menegon, for inviting me to give this talk. I was very, in a sense, relieved when I saw the title of the session in which I am speaking, because I'm one of those scholars with maybe a very big imagination, and more than, I would say, someone who is more than somebody who is providing tools, well, a muser rather than a builder. So I should say that I'm a historian of science, and what I study are basically Western scientific and technical learning in late Ming to mid-Qing China, and a different but connected issue, the role of the sciences and of technology in the construction of the Qing state. So this is where I speak from. Now, of course, there are very close links between the history of science working on these topics and the history of Christianity in China. I think what Eugenio has just said, about who basically we share a number of actors, whether amongst the missionaries or amongst Chinese scholars or Manchu officials. I think also I should mention that for my field, I think there is an important stake that is to bring social history together with the history of knowledge. I think that most of what I have heard here until now at this workshop is very much driven by social history, but it seems to me that whether intellectual history, history of science, history of knowledge, there is a strong need to integrate social dimensions, and this is what that's one of the points in which I believe that developing digital humanities and database is important. Especially as a historian of science, I find it important to be able to set a particular instance into general context. Okay, I read this text by this scholar who I am told by all my colleagues historians is a great man, capital G, capital M. Now, what do I do with it? How do I know what people thought about him in his time, what he knew, what he had read, who he talked to, and importantly also, who read him and what they thought of what he'd written. So in a sense, this is, I'm suggesting networking that we can trace through text, which is a way of in which networks that are not necessarily of direct social relations can be, because this can span, of course, several generations. There is a way in which, through reading scientific texts, we also can trace networks that we do need to trace in order to understand actors and their productions in context. And this is what I call connecting social relation to texts. So briefly, I would like to talk about a project that I started 10 years ago, thanks to the support of the French National Agency for Research. And the project was called Individual Itineraries and the Circulation of Technical Knowledge in Late Imperial China. So this was a research project that had a digital humanities component to it. And the central question was, what was the role of the geographic mobility of elites in the circulation of technical knowledge? Now, of course, this question, as any question one is trying to ask when doing history, has a general relevance, but it has a peculiar relevance in China if we think of the standard pattern of mobility of the elites as created by the imperial examination and then by the imperial civil service. So you would travel from home to the district, and then to the capital provincial, to the imperial capital, and then you would be sent supposedly into different places every 3 years and not where you came from. So did this have any impact on the circulation of technical knowledge? Then this was the starting point, but of course, officials, as we know, were only a small minority of the learned elites. And so we also looked at literati, medical practitioners, monks, missionaries, emperors, and for the late Qing period, students. One purpose of asking the question in this way was to desingularize the role of Europe in the history of science in China since the 17th century. So the idea, and this is not about, new and true knowledge coming from Europe and shedding light on China insofar as China wants to take it, but it's rather to, if you look at it from China, there are a number of resources on which scholars and the state could draw, and Europe is maybe not the first part of the world that you see if you try to zoom out. And in particular, in the Qing dynasty, of course, Inner Asia was very important, but so were Japan and Korea. Our project also considered various fields of knowledge, including medicine, waterworks, astronomy, etc., but also fields of knowledge that I don't have a good English word to define. I mean, an English word that would fit into a discipline taught in modern university. And I'm thinking here of Gowu, the investigation of things, of which more later. So we set ourselves two tasks. One was very much traditional scholarship, case studies proposed by each of the participants. Out of the 14 case studies, 3 centered on Jesuit missionaries and 3 others involved Jesuit missionaries in the picture or in the story without them being central. The second task was to create a georeference database. And by the end of the project, this database had about 5,000 entries. The case studies were published into 2 volumes and are therefore available. But I would now like to say a little more on the database. And remember what I said at the beginning, I am a user, not a creator in that respect. We had a relational database that was based on another database developed by a CNRS colleague who was interested in the social history of the Hispanic monarchy. So it appeared to me at a very early stage that indeed the database approach was very, I would say, social history was at the forefront compared to the kind of things I was interested in. And even that, for example, art history was also better at developing the database and also geographically situated approach to the field. So from a technical point of view, we were using FileMaker Pro. The entity, the basic entity of this database was action, and actors could be human individuals, corporate entities, or cultural objects. Rather than speak in general terms, I would like now to explain to you how I use this database to map knowledge. So this is my particular project within this general project. And this was to map knowledge that was contained in a rather short BG, a collection of 93 notes of various length written by the Kangxi Emperor. And the first thing that struck me when I started reading it is that most of the jotting have place names in it. And a lot of these place names I simply could not make sense of, locate, and they were not in the invaluable historical China GIS that was discussed yesterday, that of course I, like everybody else, used massively and actually imported into my database. So how did I input my text into that database? When you looked at the database, this is what you could see. So basically an action would connect 2 actors, and the nature of the relationship was also specified. So when you looked at the list of items, you could also see here date. Now, if on the other hand you were entering an item, you could see a little more, and in particular, this is where you see the place and its ID. Also was encoded the source type, and the entry creator. So nothing nothing very special about this, but just to show you how it worked. And here on this slide, what you can see is how I encode a short sentence that I put at the top of the slide, which I found in one of the notes by the emperor. So, which I would read, not the sentence, but my encoding of it. Rock salt has a mention by the Kangxi emperor in his collection. Because here, of course, sorry, I'm not sure I said, we have the ideas of the actors mentioned here, but you can also have a secondary actor connected to the main actor, and this is the text. So very nice. I did about 100 of these, and what happens at the end? The final result is this. I hope you can see the on your screen the coastline. This is a map of the things that the Emperor Kangxi discusses. And on this map, you can see a modern typology applied to it because there is no classification that emerges from the text itself. So plants, animals, waterways, minerals, people and technology and various geographical features. So you can see rock salt is here. And when you look at this map, this of course is the Great Wall. You can see that one conclusion you can draw from it is that the things that the emperor investigates are mainly in two kinds of places. Firstly, the provinces of the inner territories, that is the former Ming territory, where he has done inspection tours. And secondly, beyond the Great Wall, to the east, to the northeast, Manchuria, and to the west, territories that were not yet part of the Qing Empire when he wrote. And this really, I think, visualizes nicely the conclusion that, in fact, you can see the emperor's jottings as an effort to integrate the former Ming territory into the Qing policy, and but again, in a learned way, by contributing to Chinese scholarship, what you can find in those territories beyond the Great Wall, but also to display the advantages to be gained from a wider territory. And I do not need to remind you that the territory that is mapped here is the one that Qianlong went on to conquer a few decades later. So much for my project. After finishing this project, I began to be aware that, you know, what I had done by hand for a short text could be done much more effectively using the text tagging platform Marcus, on which more in a moment. Another tool which I find extremely valuable, and I hope also will be connected to other, is the recently developed Qing map, which is done in Leiden by Mario Kams and his team. And this is extremely useful because most of the, as I said, most of the place names I found in my text are not you know, administrative centers. Certainly not a mountain, which is I would say somewhere in the north of Siberia. You wouldn't find that, but they are very more often than not on Qing imperial maps. So therefore, there is somewhere out there a tool that gives you a number of places that one will need because the Qing have made them part of China's history. And to conclude, the use of Marcus has been quite intensive in a new database project that is being developed, in which I contribute, but is actually coordinated by my colleague Zhao Bing, who also works for CNRS, and which focuses on the circulation of enameled objects between France and China. So you see, I was discussing history of science. This workshop is about Christianity, and we find, as in the question that was just asked, global trade closely related, and I do not think we can separate the three. So far, what the project has accomplished is systematic data extraction from the archives of the workshop of the Imperial Palace using Marcus, And we are now working on these items, the lists of technical terms, place names, personal names, functions, names of objects, etc., that we have extracted in order to develop a database. We'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Catherine. You have been perfect. It's barely over 15. Now we are going to open the Q&A. Just a reminder that as you listen, please remember that part of the goal of this workshop is to position the China Historical Christian Database to succeed. So what can we learn from what is shared today? So you're welcome, of course, to ask about the project, but also how they can be useful to our project. So I have opened now my Q&A. Let's see. I don't see questions yet. So I wanted actually to report on some questions that were asked in the previous session, which is about objects. Some people asked, are you going to trace also the movement of objects? And I think that, Catherine, this was one of the major ideas that you had, that also objects are actors in networks, or there are important theories about this. Can you expand a little bit on that? I agree that this is very important, but it's not always so easy to do.
Yes, it is actually, I think it's actually probably even more than some of the things I have thought of one could do with the digital humanities. Very, I mean, it's a utopia, right? As we all know, typically when we find an object and we go to the archives, we find lots of archival materials for pieces that resemble the object, but not for the object. And then somewhere else, we will have information about a craftsman, and somewhere else about a ship. But we will never, I would say individuals or books are somewhat easier to trace than object. But in a sense, this, this doesn't mean that we should not try and bring objects into the picture, because if we are saying that missionaries traveled on ships, and ships were not just carrying missionaries, but the ships were there because of the trade, and we know the role missionaries played in the trade. I think that we do not maybe know yet how, but yes, we have to bring them into the picture.
Yeah. There is a comment from Professor Ball. Professor Jamy makes an important distinction in databases, those created for many to use, such as the China Historical GIS, and those created to pursue a particular set of research questions, and both are valuable. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that.
Oh, well, I couldn't agree more, but I would say yesterday when we have spoken about crowdsourcing, for me, one of the questions is, can my small database, and many others I have heard of or seen, be of any use in any way? Can it be shared somehow? Maybe not necessarily through the big ones, but sometimes I find we have uncovered information that would belong neatly somewhere in a large database. So apart from going to items after items, I think we need to think about how the two can be articulated.
You talked also about mapping and names, and that was actually also an issue that was raised for my paper. You encountered a lot of names that are in Manchu, that are very. How did you go about doing research on those?
Painfully, I think learning Manchu, which I've done in the last 10 years, was essential, because I can find nowadays a Chinese, what looks like a Chinese place name in Kongxi's text. And then I say, I guess this is like this in Manchu. And then that's why I mentioned the qingmap.org website. I find it there. And of course, the official transcription that is found from the Qianlong era on is different. But if you're the Kangxi Emperor, you don't care how other people write things, right? And there is actually a very good article that's just come out in East Asian Science, Technology and Medicine on the issue of toponyms and the use of various Chinese language, Manchu language, as opposed to Chinese scripts and Manchu scripts. So I think we are beginning to understand better and better how to do this. But of course, here I'm just talking about the specific problems between Manchu and Chinese. Of course, there will also be names in Mongolia, etc. And then if we look at the interface with Western languages, still another story.
Thank you so much. And I close with another comment from Peter Ball. How to share? We need to figure this out. So that's really important. Let's move now, after thanking Professor Jamy, to our next presenter, Alex Mayfield. He will be he's a PhD candidate in the School of Theology and at the Center for Global Christianity and Mission at Boston University. And he's really the technical architect of our database. So everything you see is because he has done it. And we professors are just the clueless academic leaders who are just dreaming, and he's the one who's making. His paper or his presentation is about local and transnational relationships of Pentecostals in Hong Kong between 1907 and 1942, a social network analysis. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. I'm going to be sharing my screen now. Hope you can all see that. Yeah, so thank you for coming. I'm really honored to see such enthusiasm about this project and the workshop. And today I'd like to actually take a more narrative approach and talk about really some of the doctoral research, which has, I think, served as an imaginative spark for what has become the CHCD. So as for our topic today in this session, I think this is perhaps an example of what can be delivered. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and hope this is a good time. So in December 1910, Frank Bartleman sat down at a borrowed desk in Hong Kong to pen a letter to the prominent British Pentecostal periodical Confidence. An American, Bartleman was a worldwide traveling evangelist and one of the earliest chroniclers of the Pentecostal movement around the world. So during the early years of the Pentecostal movement, Bartleman had traveled from country to country, visiting Pentecostal revivals and sending short overviews of them to his readers around the globe. So by late 1910, Bartleman was turning his sights onto Asia and hopping between various Pentecostal centers in Japan, China, and India. So Bartleman had arrived in port just a few days earlier and had been filled in on the status and the prospects of Pentecostal mission within the colony. Most notably, he had learned all about the newest effort to unite all the Pentecostal missionaries into the colony by forming a single missionary home in which all the missionaries and Chinese leadership could live together. In his letter to the British readers, Bartleman opined, "The work in Hong Kong belongs peculiarly to the interest of the worldwide Pentecostal saints or body. It can never be otherwise successfully. This brother and sister Gar, the leaders of the movement, plainly realize they will keep it so. Missionaries from all over the world and from every Pentecostal source and center are coming here. It must be theirs." For Bartleman, Hong Kong belonged to the interest of the worldwide Pentecostal movement. In other words, it was an important node in the global Pentecostal network. The port was located just a throwing distance from the interior. It was the gateway to South China, and the United Missionary Home was meant to be a staging post for all of the hopeful Pentecostal missionaries who would help save, sanctify, and spirit baptize China. See, Bartleman's rhetoric, however, was more than triumphalist discourse. It was an impassioned plea to thwart forces within the Pentecostal movement which were already threatening to break apart the global network. In the earliest days of revival, Pentecostal missionaries and evangelists believed that their God-given gifts of tongues were a gift for the entire global church, and that the power of the Spirit would unify them as they evangelized the world. But this utopian vision of Pentecostal triumph was a short-lived mirage. And by 1911, the forces of racism, regionalism, nationalism, and a host of theological disagreements were already reasserting themselves within this evangelical movement. Bartleman's pleas ultimately fell on deaf ears. Over the course of the next few decades, the unified global Pentecostal network devolved into this less connected sub-networks defined by denomination and region and race. Still, Bartleman's observation about the strategic importance of Hong Kong and the Pentecostal network was prescient. The small colony proved to be a microcosm of the evolving nature of the Pentecostal movement around the globe. In Hong Kong, Chinese Pentecostal leaders and foreign missionaries worked together to achieve local and regional goals, yet the weft and weave of the transnational Pentecostal network exerted itself on the nature of the Pentecostal movement in the city. So demonstrating the microcosmic dimensions of the Hong Kong Pentecostal network, however, requires careful groundwork. To that end, I want to quickly discuss two areas, both of which pull from my dissertation work. So first, I'm going to overview my own efforts at recreating the pre-World War II Pentecostal network of Hong Kong. And then following that kind of brief technical section, I'm going to discuss kind of the overarching story of what was produced by that social network analysis. So recreating the Hong Kong Pentecostal network. So to recreate the pre-World War II network of Hong Kong, I combined traditional historical methodologies with digital methodologies to create a database which recorded the geographic locations, relationships, and thematic discourse of Hong Kong Pentecostals. The primary source material utilized to fill this database were Pentecostal periodicals. Now, while other primary sources are available, like letters, home, and things like that, Pentecostal periodicals make up the bulk of the Pentecostal archival materials. Moreover, thanks to the digitizing efforts of Pentecostal archivists, these sources are readily available in digital format. So altogether, 6,035 periodical issues were collected, and these periodicals were then placed through a process of enhanced optical character recognition and a series of regular expressions that helped me isolate references to Hong Kong. And this brought the collection of 6,000 down to about 1,000 periodical issues which mentioned Hong Kong, and then I hand-coded those for locations, relationships, and spiritual themes. This data was then recorded in a graph database with a flexible data scheme. You can see that data scheme on the PowerPoint right now. And this choice allowed me to actually take that data and then use multiple modes of analysis to begin to understand what that data was showing me. So the purposes of what I'm about to talk about, the data that was in the database was manipulated to produce several time interval social network graphs. So as you can see in this figure, the database does record some form of relationships between people, mostly things like fathers, aunts, sisters. These are familial relationships. Beyond these sorts of ties, however, the database doesn't have a way to tell us if people simply knew each other. That's hard to track in a database because it's such an informal relationship. So in an attempt to measure this, I wrote a query that was written to connect any two people who were present at the same institution in the same calendar year. So if they were present at a mission station or a church or something like that, odds are, at least historically, they probably knew each other or at least knew of each other. So while that's an imperfect measure, it can provide us a basic framework of who knew or who knew of each other, kind of the basic network of Pentecostals. And a final caveat to this approach, I should be noted. See, religious periodicals, like the ones I used, are a distinct form of public discourse, and they both reveal and veil. So religious periodicals are a distinct form of discourse that really were the lifeblood of the Pentecostal movement. Pentecostal missionaries relied upon them as a means for fundraising. And so as public-facing documents, as a public-facing discourse, what we get in these periodicals are self-constructions for the benefit of Pentecostal writers, readers, and potential supporters. So thus, any maps or formulas analysis derived from these sources aren't necessarily a representation of what happened, although it's related to that, but they are a representation of the happenings which were deemed most important and digestible by the Pentecostal community. So thus the mentions of peoples and places by Pentecostal writers can also be thought of as a form of trading in social capital. These mentions can be seen as a form of social positioning in which, in turn conferred benefits or detriments to the author. So with that caveat mentioned and a little bit on the technical side, I want to talk about what this analysis found. So The story of the Pentecostal Social Network in Hong Kong reveals a great deal about the evolving self-understanding of the Pentecostal movement and its transnational process of institutionalization. Contemporary historiographic consensus on the origins of the Pentecostal movement tend to emphasize the international dimensions of the Pentecostal movement, and the origin of the movement is cast as this gradual knitting together of various revival centers around the world. And this narrative is in contrast to older approaches which look at Pentecostalism as this sort of centrifugal American phenomenon. My analysis of Hong Kong, however, suggests that either approach is simplistic, or it at least doesn't account for the ongoing transnational ties that affected Pentecostals in the colony. To tell this story, I want to walk through 5 7-year social network snapshots of the network, and they go between 1907 and 1942. And these graphs are broken down by gender and nationality. And just so we can kind of help you orient you as you look at these, blue represents foreign men, purple represents foreign women, red represents Chinese men, and orange represents Chinese women. So the circles are bigger also if they have more connections, they're more central to the network, and they're smaller if they have less connections. So this is the map from 1907 to 1913. What can it tell us? So when Pentecostals arrived to Hong Kong in 1907, they arrived as a really disparate band of radical evangelicals. They had a whole slew of new practices and new ideas about what God was doing. But most importantly, they also arrived with little to no missionary training and preparation. And they had to rely heavily on Christian bilingual Chinese elites within the colony. One such elite was named Mok Lai Chi. He was an educator, a former treasurer for the Hong Kong YMCA, and he's represented by the largest red dot there. It became a major hub for the movement, and he was even acknowledged as the pastor of this combined Chinese foreign mission, and he edited the first Chinese Pentecostal newspaper in the colony and in China in general. Another interesting facet of this network is also its sheer size and interconnectivity. You can see in this central cluster of Pentecostals, they're all the dots are about the same size, meaning that they're highly interconnected. Orbiting around this central cluster are many smaller ones, representing often the many Pentecostals who passed through the colony, like Frank Bartleman. And as you can see, also, this network will shrink dramatically in the coming decades. The final important feature of this network is the number of foreign women. It's well known that foreign missionary women outnumbered male missionaries in China, but here, rather than on the periphery of the network, they are highly connected and at the center of the Pentecostal network, and they represent some of the largest hubs of connection within it. And this facet will not change. You will see over and over again in these snapshots the ways in which women dominated the space of Hong Kong Pentecostalism. But however, this interconnected cluster of relationships was not fated to last. So by the late teens, the Pentecostal network had dramatically fractured along national lines in Hong Kong. As more and more missionaries fled into the colony, Mok's leadership and Chinese leadership in general over the joint Sino-foreign venture was hard to maintain. And eventually the racial tension spilled over, and by 1912, the Chinese foreign enterprise collapsed. Soon, Anna M. Dean, a former educator from New York, became a new hub for mission for the foreigners in the eastern suburbs of Hong Kong, and the Chinese network was split. As noticeable, also noticeable in this graph is the much smaller number of Pentecostals in general. And this has multiple causes. No doubt the shortage of men can be linked to the demand for men to fight in the front lines at home during World War I. But the front lines of mission were also opening up, and many missionaries who had once called the colony home were finally going into the mystical interior of China. And at the same time, the Pentecostal network in North America was in the process of denominationalizing. Running along regional lines, these new denominations began to take over previously unaffiliated newspapers and began corralling missionaries into ordered groupings, making it harder for the globe-trotting evangelists, many people on the peripheries of that first picture, to capitalize on the relatively unregulated periodicals of earlier periods. So as denominational heads took over editorships and began appointing missionaries, the flood of faith missionaries slowly ebbed into a small trickle. And this split, however, left these two disconnected clusters at a disadvantage. The Chinese network lost its tenuous grasp on the international network of funding that was sustained through these periodicals. From here on out, they actually disappear from these depictions of the Pentecostal social network. They do not appear in periodicals anymore until about 1937. Although they continue to exist, they were largely cut off from the global network of Pentecostalism. The foreign network, however, was also at a distinct disadvantage because they had lost their Chinese translators and coworkers. So while they had a marginally better funding structure, they sorely needed help. So to that end, the early and mid 20s, the foreign Pentecostals began building a network for Pentecostal missionaries in Hong Kong. They began to hire Chinese pastors, Chinese Bible women, and colporteurs, and they began to utilize the denominational periodical network to advocate for better funding, to share testimonies of Chinese converts, and to send home stories of their own successes. This tight clustering of the period is indicative of the tight denominational growth of the period. Chinese who began to work with Pentecostal missionaries stayed connected to them and the structures they created. And this growth of Chinese personnel was complicated by growth in missionary personnel. As denominations began to get their institutional structures in place, they gradually were able to send a steady stream of missionaries to bolster many of the old hands who had been on the field for some time. And thus, in 1928 to 1924 was a great period. What should have been a great period of growth, however, became a great period of destabilization, brought about by a multitude of global causes and regional causes. First off, the tightening of the belt at home due to the Depression caused many Pentecostal funding sources to dry up. Also, the tumultuous political happenings in southern China caused Hong Kong to change dramatically. Many missionaries from the interior were actually forced to the coast and began forming their own networks not directly linked to earlier ones, as you can see around the edges of the central cluster there. The same tumult caused several missionaries actually to take extended furloughs and to even give up the field entirely. But what's most interesting about this chart in particular is the things it doesn't show. So you see, caught in the shadows of regional and global crises, many missionaries were in fact located in Hong Kong, many more than are depicted here. But they simply did not think to write home in periodicals about what they were doing there. Of all the network graphs depicted thus far, this most likely is the one divorced furthest from Pentecostal reality of who's actually in Hong Kong. But it's also telling because it's showing exactly how Hong Kong's status and meaning has shifted within the Pentecostal periodical network. Finally, in this final 7-year period, it's marked by a sense of renewed growth within the Pentecostal network. Like the period before, it's largely driven by a tumult of the interior, which shrank missionary opportunities inland. But as missionaries began to return again and again to the coast, they gradually began to accept Hong Kong as a place, a sphere of missionary action. Likewise, the prominence of Chinese men and women began to felt more in this period. The many Bible women, pastors, and colporteurs who had cut their teeth in the earlier decades of the movement were coming into their own and beginning to take on more prominent locations within the social network. Bible women like Lum San Chui and Annie Young were essential and well-known parts of the network, and men like Dr. Chan Pak Chui represented a new type of global Pentecostal elite who is ready to chart their own path without the help of foreign missionaries. The dream of a new period of growth, however, ended in December 1941 as Japanese invaded the colony and the missionary Pentecostal network collapsed. What arose after the Japanese left would take on a dramatically different form. Though brief, this social network analysis has illustrated that the global nature of the Pentecostal movement changed dramatically in this period from 1907 to 1942. The relationship between Chinese and foreign Pentecostals was perhaps the largest victim of these changes. While the faith missions of the earlier period allowed for a more international and more egalitarian network, global economic disparities and denominationalization processes in North America led to an influx of foreign missionaries, which strained the balance of the network. Over time, the denominational Pentecostals built their own network, but a grand Pentecostal enterprise was not to be. Global depression, international warfare, and Chinese political turmoil determined the fate of the network and ultimately threatened to destroy it. So the push and pull of local, regional, and international ties meant that the Pentecostal movement that washed up on Hong Kong shores was not the same one that left its shores in 1942. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation that really shows the potential of digital scholarship to understand networks. And of course, you have this all very fresh in your mind because you're writing your dissertation. There is a first question. Stephen, who is asking, was this analysis done in Gephi?
Yes. So I put this all of the data into a graph database which is based on Neo4j. And then I took it from there and I put it into the spreadsheets and used Gephi to analyze it and to create these graphs. So yes.
There is a question from Professor Xiao. I'm not sure how you deal with negative social relationship, such as opposition or hostile relationships. In the history of Christianity in China, there were anti-Christian movements, so also these relationships existed.
Yes, yeah. I think this is I had to deal with it more in my dissertation, so I had to, it doesn't show up as much in these sort of social networks. But these sort of anti-Christian movements were highly important for, especially I would say the more interior missions in South China. Hong Kong, because of its colonial situation, was impacted by things like the Canton Hong Kong strike and various kind of social movements like that. But Hong Kong's a very unique place in that Christians, especially Chinese Christians, had a special social class in Hong Kong that they didn't have necessarily in other places in China. So it's interesting. That's a very complicated question. But as for the interior, these sort of anti-Christian movements, anti-foreigner movements, were a huge driving force for pushing people to the coast. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and in the database, we will also be including these actors, these hostile actors at some point.
Yes, if they're named, and if they're named, I think events such as the Boxer Uprising or various times when I know Pentecostals certain Pentecostal missionaries were trapped in cities or even extracted via gunboat from southern China, and I think those sort of events can definitely be tracked in the database and would kind of provide a almost anti-picture of the social network of Christianity in China.
A question from Christina Wong. Have you integrated with articles in Chinese from Chinese Christian perspectives or just used American missionary writings?
Great question. So I actually, in this analysis, I utilized, there was one Chinese Pentecostal periodical, Pentecostal Truths, which ran from about 1911 to 1918. We only have about, I think, half of the run extant. So I used those in this analysis. They were depicted there, and that's for instance why we had that in that second graph where you could see the Chinese network so distinct from it. That was what preserved that kind of final picture of the Chinese network before they go dark for about a 20-year period, at least in terms of periodicals. It's a really interesting story. I mean, there's another one called Popular Pentecostal Truths, which originate out of Beijing. But these two periodicals are really kind of the main sources we have right now. Although I think there are a few that are being discovered in the Shanghai archives right now. I've been talking with Daryl Ireland about that. So hopefully more and more we get a more full picture of what's happening and a more Chinese perspective. But right now, what exists is mostly English archives.
For Hong Kong, at least.
For Hong Kong.
Yeah, when you move inland, it's different. And for your Pentecostals.
Yes, especially for my Pentecostals, when you move inland, you get a bit more in Chinese sources. But thankfully, too, Hong Kong, because it was such a bilingual place, especially among the leaders, such as the Bible women and the Chinese pastors, many of them were bilingual, and we have there at least preserved some of their not handwritten, but their personal testimonies, which have not been translated, or at least they're translated by themselves. So while there is still a linguistic, barrier to, so to speak, it at least is from them. And it's quite interesting to pick up some of those, English as a second language testimonies and to see how people are communicating and representing themselves in these periodicals.
Thank you very much, Alex, for an inspiring presentation. And now our next speaker is Chris White, who is Assistant Director of the Center on Religion and Chinese Society at Purdue University. He will be presenting on Spatial and Familial Ties That Bind, Social and Geographic Mapping of Chinese Christians in South Fujian.
Good morning. Yeah, I'm very happy to take part in this this workshop, and I've really enjoyed the presentation so far. So earlier this morning, we heard some more global perspectives, and this last presentation kind of tried to bridge the global and the local. My presentation will focus a little bit more on the local this morning. Can everybody see my screen?
Not yet. You
Oh,
should.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought it was going.
Okay, now it's
Okay.
coming. Thank you. We have it now.
Okay. Let me. So my research interests have focused on Protestant history in South Fujian. And today, I'll first talk briefly about Protestant groups in this region, then introduce the online spiritual atlas of the Global East, which maps religious sites in China, and finally end by showing a work in progress that maps local Christian historical sources in South Fujian. A main point I hope to emphasize today is the need to acknowledge, analyze, and include local level sources in creating databases such as the CHCD. These local level sources, such as genealogies, cemeteries, photos, or unofficial church histories, may seem mundane, but often reveal important social and institutional histories that are often obscured when looking from a national perspective or only using centralized archives. Map making in South Fujian owes an early debt to Reformed Church in America missionary Leonard Kipp. We see Kipp here. He lived in South Fujian for nearly 40 years, and he carried surveying equipment with him as he traveled through rural regions of the province. His map was published as a lithograph and used extensively by mission agencies and Chinese officials and institutions. So it was used not just by the mission, but also by Chinese institutes. It was the most detailed and accurate map to date and continued to be used well into the 20th century. One way the map was used was in visualizing and marking the comity agreements that mission agencies in South Fujian had agreed upon. There were three major mission agencies in the region: the Reformed Church in America, London Missionary Society, and the Presbyterian Church of England. These three groups agreed to divide the region into spheres of work so that their efforts would not be duplicated. And we can see how they divided this here. I'm sorry, having just a little bit of issues here. Okay. The geography of churches and comity agreements had real life significance for early Chinese Protestants. Where churches were located and to which mission they affiliated were extremely formative, especially for rural Protestants. It was common for churchgoers to have to travel to attend church. This varied from walking a couple kilometers to a neighboring village to having to travel 20 to 30 kilometers each way to church every weekend. Because membership in churches required church attendance on Sundays, which was unlike worship at the predominant temple system, the geographic location of churches created what I have referred to as sustained mobility. That is the weekly travel of churchgoers to the same place at the same time. Such sustained mobility greatly influenced what some scholars refer to as activity space, or the geographic area where one typically moves and forms relationships. The weekly worship structure and the sustained mobility of geographically dispersed churches greatly affected the social networks of Chinese Protestants. Churches served as nodes that gathered people from various villages and towns, many that typically had little or no previous interaction. This was transformative for many things, such as sharing ideas or expanding a family's potential marriage network. The geographical distributions from the comity arrangements were also very influential for many Chinese Protestants. particularly for students and preachers or pastors. When going to school or working at a church, it was common to move to a new area, but this was typically done within the particular mission's geographical sphere. So, for example, Zhou Zhide was a notable pastor affiliated with the London Missionary Society. Zhou was born here in Hui'an County, which was a London Missionary Society region. As a youngster, he moved to Xiamen, attended school here, and then was assigned to be a preacher in the Xiang'an region and the Jiangzhou region here. Both of these also on this map are yellow, which indicates their London Missionary Society regions. He was ordained and took a pastorate at a church in Xiamen before, after 20 years, relocating to the west of the province to Changting or Tingzhou, which again was an LMS region. So we see all of his mobility connected to his schooling and his preaching and pastoring was in London Missionary Society regions. The comedy arrangements determined his geographic mobility. This in turn had significant impact on his network and his family. One of Zhou's daughters married a preacher in Tingzhou. Because of his family's connection to Western Fujian, one of his sons, a professor at Xiamen University, was tasked with leading the school to relocate to Tingzhou during the Japanese invasion. So these comedy arrangements had a significant impact, not only on his life and mobility, but even on his descendants. The argument I hope to make here is how maps were made and used and the geographic distribution of church institutions had real effects on the lives and networks of Chinese Protestants in the 19th and 20th centuries. Many of these effects continue to have real impacts on the descendants of these early church members through established marriage networks or visits to ancestral grave sites or familial connections to remote congregations that persist until today. Now I would like to shift gears a bit and turn to introduce the online spiritual atlas of the Global East, or OSAGE. This multi-year project was initiated by Professor Fenggang Yang at the Center on Religion in the Global East, which until recently was called the Center on Religion and Chinese Society at Purdue University. So recently we just changed our name. OSAGE maps over 70,000 official religious sites in China. The data is from the 2004 economic census. After years of cleaning this data and designing a database and interactive platform, OSAGE has been available online for over a year. It allows users to filter based on religion or based on geographic region. For example, we can see Protestant churches in Fujian by using the filter like this. So this is all of these 70,000 religious sites in China. The different colors represent the different religions, so 5 main religions. But I can filter out if I just want to choose Protestantism, and then I can choose a geographic region such as Fujian, and I turn it on here, it will limit it to only Fujian. Now I can zoom in, and then I could even click on one and find out more information, the name of this church, the address, and oftentimes it will include the year of founding, at least what was recorded in the 2004 economic census. So you could do this for different religions. You could do this for different geographic areas. You can also search a specific term or a religious site here. Another thing this can do is we can show how religions are distributed over different prefectures or provinces or counties. So for example, this will show the predominant religion based on the number of religious sites for different prefectures in China. And so the red here would be Protestant, the blue here would be Taoist, the purple here would be Catholic, and we have Islam and Buddhist here. We are now updating this data, and in the near future, we will add an additional 50,000 religious sites to the China map, and also add a map showing the religious sites in Korea. So we look forward to expanding this in the very near future. For the third part of this short talk, I would like to show a work in progress in which I am mapping and making available local Christian history sources in Fujian. I've collected dozens of church commemorative volumes in Fujian. These sources, which I refer to as congregational genealogies, are typically published by churches in connection to an anniversary celebration. These books include the history of the church and often provide old photos and biographical information on major figures in the church's history. Much of this information is not available in other sources, such as archives or missionary reports. And these volumes are often not widely distributed, but only within the region or to those that attend the anniversary celebration. I have also collected dozens of genealogies produced by Christian families in South Fujian. I don't have time to discuss much of the analysis on these congregational or familial genealogies today, but I have begun to map these and would like to show this here. And so here, the red balloons on this map show these congregational genealogies. So these are kind of like church histories that are produced typically for an anniversary celebration. So 120-year or 150-year anniversary of a church. They often print one of these books, and it will record the history and the leadership and different things about the church. That's the red balloons. The blue balloons here show family genealogies, so Christian family genealogies. As I scroll through the list, these locations are highlighted. Each of these is linked to a PDF or some other file, which can be viewed by clicking on it. And so, for example, I will show you this. This is the Yiban Church in Hui'an. This is the first church founded in the county in 1865. But not only does this book provide a history of this church, you see photos and congratulatory remarks, but it also provides a history of many other churches in that region. In fact, a total of 27 independent congregations that trace their heritage back to this mother church are included. Many of these books include the names of church pastors or leaders over the years. And some of them even include current members. But what is more common is that they include information on who donated money for the building of the current church structure. And so we can see that here, if I scroll through these individual church histories, we can also see who gave money and how much money they gave. Such name lists show interesting connections between congregations, families, and various geographic regions. For instance, here we can see the sizable influence from overseas Chinese and Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And many of these congregational genealogies will show things like this. And oftentimes they include these transnational connections, at least in South Fujian. They include these transnational connections. The interconnected networks are even more evident in the family genealogies. The interconnected networks are even more evident in the family genealogies that I've collected and mapped here. These sources range from professionally designed books to simple Excel sheets. The family of Yang Xiantu shows the historical interconnectedness of many Christian families in the region. And so I'll show this family here, Yang Xiantu. And if we take a look at, here's an Excel sheet that kind of maps out the family tree, but I've kind of simplified that to show this. And what I'd like to point out here is this simple chart reveals that one descendant down here, who is a friend of mine in the city of Xiamen, she's in her 30s. She is simultaneously the 7th generation descendant and the 6th generation descendant from this single person, Yang Xiantu here. This shows the linkages between these Christian families and how Christian communities served as conduits for marriage networks. One important characteristic of the Christian genealogies that I have mapped is that they not only include male descendants, but also daughters. And in most cases, they further list the descendants of the daughters. The result is the genealogy has many surnames. For instance, if we take a look at this genealogy here, this is the Ye Xueli genealogy. This was written by a descendant of Ye Xueli, who was born in the mid-19th century. The compiler of this genealogy, he traces his heritage back to Ye Xueli, but you'll notice his surname is Xue. So these genealogies, it's not just for the Ye family, because after the founder, the amount of surnames really expands. Currently, this platform, which is not online, but only on my local computer for now, does not show the connections between the congregations and the families. It also does not show temporal or geographic movement of individuals. However, these are things that can be uncovered in the texts and things that may be added in the future. I would welcome any critiques or suggestions on this project. And let me end my comments with some brief reflections on the presentations and discussions I heard yesterday. The goal to make CHCD public facing through its online platform is to be lauded. Making the data available and accessible both in English and Chinese to the general public, not just scholars, helps dissolve the boundaries between professionals and the public. However, another aspect of decolonizing the knowledge of a database such as this is to be attuned to the kinds of sources and information the local community is interested in, and not just what scholars want. That is, local actors' concerns should be considered when determining content, not just accessibility. For instance, in my experience speaking with Protestant communities in Fujian, a major interest in the history of Christianity in the region is old photos. Many of these were lost or were never made available in China, but they are of great interest to the people. This is just one example of how a database such as CHCD can serve public interests and lessen the distance between scholars and local actors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really are pressed for time. We'll have to leave in a couple of minutes. The first question from Peter Ball. The use of the genealogy form to incorporate believers of different surnames is interesting. Do they also make use of the gazetteer format, such as were created in the past for places, but also for private academies?
So in many ways, the congregational genealogies, what I call congregational genealogies, are very similar to family genealogies in that they have this similar format. And this is not too different from the gazetteer format, where they'll have these brief biographies of influential people. These texts very rarely make reference to gazetteers. Almost all of them are within the last 10 to 20 years. So they're not old text, and rarely do they make reference to the gazetteers.
A second question, do you do field research while working on this project? Do you use some of oral materials? How do you deal with the issue of local dialects, from Professor Xiao?
Right, so all of this was collected, all of the materials here were collected during field research. I lived in Xiamen for about 12 years and collected this over that period. I don't have any oral history included in this. This is all either these congregational books or these family genealogies that I've collected. But my own research hasn't included oral history.
And last question, very important to provide historical depth and localized information to the already great contribution of the Religious Atlas. Hopefully that will continue. Will you do that also for other religions? Elena Valusti.
My plan now.
Eh?
That's not my plan now. My plan is not to branch out. This is enough for now.
Okay, very good. So we have now to close. In 1 minute, we'll be in the common room. You have the link from the Zoom guide, and Alison Rush, who is our who is our leader here, can help if you have any problems. I'm leaving now. Please check in your chat. You have there the link to move to the next room. Bye-bye.